You are listening to episode 149 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Thorsten Barnhofer, Amit Bernstein, and Vago join us to talk about the science of mindfulness. What do we really know, and where do we go? If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. Over the past 2 decades, popular and scientific interest in mindfulness has rapidly developed. While a total of 39 scientific papers were published before the year 2000, today that number is upwards of 6,000 papers. Likewise, mindfulness practices and interventions have found their way into nearly every sector of society, including healthcare, schools, corporations, law enforcement, government, policymaking, military, social justice movements, and mobile applications, with reach and access to millions of new practitioners. But in recent years, critical voices have emerged asking whether the applications of mindfulness have gotten ahead of the evidence. Scholars, scientists, and practitioners continue to push the field forward while also working to temper the hype and oversimplification of mindfulness research findings. 3 researchers across 3 continents set out to take stock and map the state of the field. They invited more than 100 scholars to write 57 papers, critically reflecting on the data. Together, they sought to bring attention to concerns facing the field, accurate and tempered interpretations of existing data and findings, and to highlight developments across domains of contemporary mindfulness science and practice. They've now published this large project as a special issue in Current Opinions in Psychology. Amit Bernstein, PhD, is a professor of psychology, director of the Observing Minds Lab at the University of Haifa, and member of the Israel Young Academy. Amit is interested in how well-being and suffering are impacted by the ways in which we process, experience, and respond to our internal states, and thereby how mindfulness and mental training may be used therapeutically. His team is currently studying the nature and function of attention in mental health, the salutary and curative properties and mechanisms of mindfulness, and the therapeutic translation of this work to care for vulnerable refugee populations. Thorsten Barnhofer is professor for clinical psychology at the University of Surrey. He has been involved in work on mindfulness for people with affective disorders for many years, and has a keen interest in understanding the psychological and biological mechanisms of mindfulness training. He is the recipient of a Heisenberg Fellowship from the German Research Foundation, and teaches mindfulness workshops for mental health professionals nationally and internationally. Vago is Associate Professor in the Departments of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He is part of the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, where he directs the Contemplative Neuroscience and Integrative Medicine Laboratory. Dave also maintains an appointment as research associate at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He has completed postdoctoral fellowships in biological and social psychiatry, neuroimaging, and mind and body medicine at Harvard Medical School and the University of Utah School of Medicine. Dave's research interests broadly focus on utilizing translational models to identify and characterize neurobiological and psychosocial mechanisms underlying adaptive mind-brain-body interactions and their therapeutic relevance in the context of psychiatric health and chronic pain. Our guests today are David Vago. Dave, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you again.
Hey, Ted. Thanks so much for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks so much. And Thorsten Barnhofer. Thorsten, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ted. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here.
And Amit Bernstein. Amit, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Hi. Thanks very much, Ted.
So let's begin by just talking a little bit about how the three of you connected for this special issue of Current Opinions in Psychology. What happened? How did you guys connect about this particular topic?
Well, who wants to take that one?
Well,
You have to start, Amit.
I should start?
Yes, you are the originator.
I'll start. I think we'll talk in a bit about how the idea for this project came about, and also how it really grew and changed and evolved after David, Thorsten, and I started to work on it together, and after we reached out to the field to think through it and develop it. But just initially, I had just sort of looked for two colleagues that I knew and respected and liked, and I thought would bring perspectives that were complementary and that represented sort of different, not only disciplinary perspectives, but also sort of different communities of the sort of global mindfulness research and practice meta community. It was really just sort of, and it was sort of fortuitous sort of thing. And they were nice enough to agree. Took a little bit of convincing, but they...
Much arm twisting on that.
I think I remember you saying something like, "Oh, it won't take much of your time."
It's not about...
I may have said something like that. And I was talking with Ted earlier about when we actually met. And I don't know when the two of you met. I remember meeting Thorsten in Birmingham. Do you remember Thorsten?
Yeah, 2013, that was.
I'm impressed you remember the year. And Dave, do you remember either how or when you and I met? I can't remember.
I do. I think it was the SPSP meeting, the Psychosomatic Society, or one of those social psych meetings that everyone goes to. What's that one called?
Really?
Or a clinical one that Dave Fresco organized.
It was through Dave.
Yeah. And there was a meet, and we were in a panel together. It was me, you, Judd, and Ruth Bear.
ABCT.
That's right. ABCT, yes. Ruth Bear, myself, Judd, and you.
In
right?
Chicago. In Chicago. That's right.
Was it Chicago?
Chicago.
Oh.
Almost. I'll have to look it up.
Or it may have been actually Nashville, actually. Anyway.
I didn't go to Nashville.
Oh, you didn't go down. So this is what happens, Ted. You get us on video talking. We'll just chat for a long time.
And that's part of the intent of the podcast, is giving voice to people. So great. And Thorsten, how about
so that was probably, I don't know how many years ago that was. But that was a while ago, and that's when I first what we connected on was the dialogue. You had a nice way of teasing out the answers to some of the difficult questions, I thought, and that was you. I remember that struck me as being a powerful tool in this discussion that we're having, really about how contemplation is a good thing for us in terms of mental health, physical health, right? So that was the first time I thought that we could potentially work again together. And then you reached out again, I think, we reached out together. We saw each other at the Mind and Life Contemplative Studies.
Very nice.
Conference.
And Thorsten, how about you and David? How did you two meet? Do you recall?
Days a long time back, actually. We must have met at Mind and Life Summer Research Institutes. And I don't remember exactly the year, but it is through this community that we met and met again and kind of stayed in dialogue. And I think that's the network that catalyzed a lot of what we've reported on in the current opinion issue.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm wondering how the idea for this special issue came up.
Well, the editors of this journal, this is this current opinion in psychology is a neat journal in that it's unusual in that it has these kind of like meta chief editors that try to identify special issue editors who, from really across a very, very wide scope of ideas and methods and questions. And they thought that an issue on mindfulness would be timely and interesting. And they reached out, and I said no a few times because I just wasn't convinced that another special issue and another group of papers would really merit asking people to take the time it takes to write these kind of academic papers. But I had sort of won this kind of fantasy and this sort of condition. Were we able to do something of a scale and scope that would really be unique and would really potentially have impact on the field, and something that would really involve the field, then that could be a really cool project. And I knew that I could not do that. I would not be able to put that together, not intellectually, but also not in terms of connections to this community. So that was the sort of what initiated the first conversations with David and Thorsten, which was, well, if we did this, how might we go about doing it so that it really actually mattered, that it really had meaningful impact on the field? Maybe you guys want to, do you guys remember any other earlier conversations about that?
I wanted to ask each of you, what are your thoughts? What was it like when you got that call or that email about, hey, how about this? What was that like? Dave, maybe starting with you.
Again, it warms my heart to hear Amit talk about it, because I think the way he's able to sell it is through an emotional pitch like that, because it was convincing enough to me when he said, this is an important time. Don't you think we should be doing something collectively to impact the field? And I did not disagree with him. I thought that was absolutely a great idea. So I think it just naturally sort of manifested from there. I don't think I was already wrapped into Amit's clutches at that point. He already won me over somehow, and we were going to do something. And so that's when I agreed to it. And I was excited. It really is an important time to reflect on what we've accomplished and where we're going, just to maintain the meta piece to our field as it develops. And that's exactly what this special issue can do for us.
Great, thank you. And Thorsten, how about you? When you were contacted about this, what was that like for you?
Yeah, pretty much the same experience. I think it was the enthusiasm that Amit and Dave brought was simply contagious. And then at the same time, I think once you start looking into it and ideas developed, it was possible to see how this could grow into something that would be quite helpful for the field, yet at the same time, you don't quite know what you're letting yourself in for at that early stage. So I think we didn't expect it to be of this size and to take as long as it took. and there's also a sense, I think, for me that at the time there was a narrative evolving in the field of where research is. And it seemed like a good time to actually take stock and to see what's really out there. How good is this? Because there was this narrative that a lot of it is very early stages, a lot of concerns. And, at the same time, when you look at the literature, you get a sense of there also is a lot to be celebrated. And so bringing all of those aspects together, it seemed like a timely endeavor.
It's interesting hearing each of you say this first, hearing your care about this, that in addition to it being an intellectual draw, that there was also an emotional draw. And the spectrum of views that are currently out there to mindfulness is a cure-all for stuff, which we know is not, all the way to, no, this is completely ineffective denialism. And then there's the appropriate, I think, awarenesses around minding the hype, being careful. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't. Here's what we're seeing. To the McMindfulness folks who have a different perspective on it. And one also that I think contributes to how we see these things. And so as you started to collect the papers for the special edition, I'm curious what some of the most interesting or insightful contributions that stood out for each of you. If you would just take a moment and think about what was oh yeah, that one, that was really interesting. Like to start.
I should say one thing that I'm hesitating to say, but I at least you mentioned it, Ted, but the McMindfulness movement that's happening too, and not to put shade there or to even put more attention there, but here I'm just saying that I think there's a difference between the hype and so the quality of the studies that are out there and then sort of the messaging that we're talking about specifically about where we are in terms of the science. And then there's McMindfulness, which is a different movement that's really commenting more on this political sort of positioning of mindfulness too in society with this neoliberal sort of attachment that it's claiming. So I want to make sure that it's a different stream of what we're really reporting on. I think that's an important perspective, but we're really focusing on where the science is and what the science says and what it doesn't.
Right, and that's actually one of the engagements that I get involved with is when there are assertions made about the state of the science in mindfulness, and there will be sometimes valid issues pointed out, and often ones that I find somewhat spurious in their reasoning. And so sometimes science is used in a way to support that narrative. And we're talking about something different here. We're talking about what do we know? What are some of the things that are good indications, knowing that there is some good science out there and it is growing. And there's also science that could have been done better. And these are the things that we're learning from.
I think that, like, with respect to your question, and I think also what Dave is raising here is that one of the biggest initial challenges that the three of us struggled with for quite some time actually was, what does this field entail? And what disciplines are represented? And how do you go about classifying this quite large body of ideas and work in a way that is coherent, complementary, and actually at least fairly depicts the map and state of the field, and also is a kind of whole. It has some kind of, it will help us to answer the kind of questions that you're asking, which is, so where are we going, as a field? And so I think that one of the things that's actually useful and deserves probably some degree of reflection, maybe also some degree of criticism, is how we went about figuring out how to organize it and who to invite and what should we ask them to write about? And will they agree? And all those sorts of things. And I think even the way that it's organized, first of all, I don't think it's the only way that could be organized, but also I think says important things about the state of the field. Dave, Thorsten, do you guys want to say something about this? I'm curious what you guys think about this in hindsight, in terms of the sections and the subsections, how it's organized.
Yeah, the challenge is that we're not talking about, one area of where mindfulness, focuses, right? Like if we could just study the effect of mindfulness on attention, right? If it only affected one system, right? But it doesn't. It affects multiple systems, right? And multiple aspects of society are impacted by it. So how do you capture the impact when it's, so broad? And that was a challenge for sure. I do recall we went back and forth on exactly how to, create a way that it reflects the field, but in a coherent narrative, right? That it creates a narrative that you can say, okay, well, here's the basic science, the clinical science, the philosophical underpinnings, and where's the debate? Where are the issues that are problematic?
Thorsten, how about for you?
Yeah, I think I have that same sense. It could have been categorized in different ways, but in the end, I think it's a pragmatic decision to find some form that doesn't restrict what is being offered. And I think it's served that quite well. I had a look at John's foreword just recently, and what he highlighted, and I think quite rightly, is that what this is it's an expression of an ongoing conversation. And so I think one of the main issues here was not to restrict that conversation. And I think the structure has served very well to do that. My concern, I think, is at the other end of the spectrum, because this is a quite comprehensive issue, and yet at the same time you can think of many, many other people who should have been included, who are doing amazing work, and we couldn't. So probably also coming back to your question, which I think we're avoiding for some reason. What were the favorite contributions that we're looking at and we're working with people on? It's such a difficult question. That's why we're avoiding. So to start with the many other people out there who should have been included, and we have to apologize. We couldn't for one reason or
we do apologize.
And then you look at the entire spectrum, and I think there's so many contributions which are important in their own right. So it's very difficult actually to pick one.
I think that there are some really cool. I think one way of approaching a question like that's hard, because there's 50-some papers here. Right. There are some ideas here that I think may not get as much focus in the field, and I think are really important and interesting. I think even if we look at this, even just as an example, if we look at this section by section, I think, for example, just as one example, the way Martine Batchelor talks about Vedanas or feeling tones is a really neat and interesting framework for making a connection between this kind of canonical Buddhist ideas about consciousness and also mindfulness practice, and something that's happening in the field in a separate field, which is about subjective emotional experience and consciousness. And it's really quite interesting, and it becomes very, very clear when she taught in this particular paper. And I think it's something that is not, that connection hasn't been made explicitly enough. It's a place where basic emotion research and mindfulness science can really speak to it, really in really interesting ways. And I hadn't thought about it before hearing her ideas about Vedanas, for example.
And interestingly, on a personal note, I was on a retreat on the Vedanas at Barry Center for Buddhist Studies with Martine and a number of other people, where we really went in depth into that topic.
It
does reveal these additional layers that even in the community that studies them, there's still new and interesting things to talk about that we just hadn't looked at in that way before.
Yeah.
I remember back actually in 2009 witnessing a conversation specifically about Vedanas with Anne Treisman, who is an amazing attention researcher. And it was just an amazing conversation between her and the Dalai Lama about they couldn't quite understand the difference between the feeling states of, or just labeling something as negative, neutral, and positive versus the feeling states, the emotional states that people experience, more that are affective expressions of an emotion, right? So that it was the translations and going back and forth, that dialogue was incredible because it showed that there was information coming, not just from the West to inform the East, but that the Buddhist science actually had some really interesting perspective on a concept that as Western scientists, this is something that's incredibly important to be able to parse apart, right? To understand how there are different ways to talk about emotion. And there it is in Vedanas. So it's such a unique field to have access to so many different disciplines that can talk about mindfulness in an academic way or a scholarly way, right? So you can have a Buddhist scholar, you can have a clinical scientist who sees that, doing mindfulness with their patients works. Then you can have your basic neurosciences is like, well, is this consciousness? And there's a physicist who's talking about, well, where is this all going? What is this all meaning? There's almost like mindfulness can be a discipline for any scientist, really, and for any person in our society. It's an issue that's important.
And so wanting to stay with this, just a little bit of what are some of the things that, maybe characterizing it as favorites isn't quite right, but what were some of the things that were interesting for you or new information that you just weren't aware of? With over 50 papers, I'm sure some things came up that were a little like, oh yeah, how about that?
I think for me, one of the things that has become quite obvious in bringing all of these papers together was that there is a trend towards diversifying interventions. And as a field, of course, this is something that doesn't happen so easily. When you look at developments of interventions in other domains, usually you find tried and tested formats and you stick with them and you develop them forwards. Yet, when you have a perspective like the perspective that we've just talked about, where you have a number of different ways of looking at the same thing through the Buddhist lens, through the basic science lens, through a clinically informed lens, then it's probably easier to be less attached to particular frameworks. So what we're seeing in a number of different fields is that there's more of a willingness to experiment with formats for interventions, looking at longer interventions rather than shorter interventions, which is a really interesting trend because when you look at the clinical side of it, the pressure always seems to be more efficient, to be using less resources.
And not just clinical side, we see that in the business world as well. Can you shorten your 2.5 hour program to 20 minutes?
Absolutely. And here's something within the field that is saying, look, there's more to this. This is a lifelong engagement. So we clearly know there are effects which will evolve way beyond that mark of 8 weeks. And that's very interesting to map that kind of development, I think. It's very important for the field.
Yeah, we're definitely enmeshed into the fields as well. So the opinions we are providing that, at least that you get in the editorial sort of reflections comes from our very perspectives, from where we're rooted in different domains of this field as well. So we all hold different perspectives that are very unique. Thorsten really provides this great perspective on the clinical aspects of how mindfulness is being used in mental health populations, and in a very and all the rigorous science that has now been done to support its role in that capacity. And then I have more of a basic neuroscience perspective, and I think I meet you with more of a cognitive, would you say, perspective as well, and more of a laboratory perspective. So I think the three of us together, it's a really unique reflection on from where what we're seeing. But then what we were able to do is just let the field speak for itself, right? So 57 submissions with 100 authors, that's a lot of voices. So it's not just ours that are speaking, but ours is just the ones that brought everybody together and told everybody else to speak.
Amit, how about for you? What are some of the things that you found most interesting or that stood out for you?
I think there's actually quite a few. I think relating to what Thorsten mentioned a moment ago, I think something very, very interesting is happening in the field, and it's highlighted in quite a few papers, and it's highlighted in papers by folks like King from Cliff Saren's group and from data from the Resource Project that is about thinking in a more holistic way about how we think about mindfulness interventions, and this idea of this kind of like next generation of mindfulness-based interventions. And there's a really nice paper that talks really in detail, the Rosenkrantz, John Dunn, and Richie Davidson paper. They do a nice job talking about, well, what do we really know, and what might these next generations interventions look like? There's a whole bunch of examples. I think a really nice example is if you go about trying to say, well, what might it look like if the field is now going to set out to try to consciously evolve some of these interventions to target different kinds of problems or to promote certain kinds of processes. How do we actually go about doing that? How do we go from MBCT to work, for example, that we've been working on in our group is, for example, adapting mindfulness and compassion practices for refugees. How do you do that? And I think a really nice paper, for example, that does that is David Fresco and Doug Menon's paper, where they try to say, well, what are common functional change principles that might be important to sort of unify basic cognitive behavioral practices and mindfulness-based therapies? And so I think there's actually quite a bit of thought and work that's being done on developing these next generation interventions. And I think, frankly, we're not there yet. I think they're really being a really good example of that is the paper by Paul Chadwick that talks about applications and development of mindfulness for psychosis. It's a really radical and cool idea. What he calls a very humanizing application of mindfulness practices. So I think there's a lot happening right now clinically in terms of the development of a next generation of mindfulness-based interventions. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for us to be in, both with how mindfulness is meeting contemporary culture.
Yeah.
It's a bit different than what it's encountered before, how it's growing in fields like clinical interventions and neuroscience, and what we're learning from that, because there are learnings. And one of the things I'm curious about also want to ask each of you is, along with that learning, there may be some ideas or perceptions about mindfulness, what it may be, knowing there are lots of different definitions of mindfulness. There's not just one true definition of what it is. There are many, and they apply in different contexts appropriately as they should. If there are some things that in each of your disciplines you run into that are something you might characterize as being a bit off, or maybe misperceptions about it. Is there something that you run into that are like, that what I might offer is another perspective thus? What do you run into?
Do you guys have any ideas? Do you want me to start off?
Well, I wanted to make sure that we, before we got there, that we made sure that we gave the proper send-off to our special issue, right? Because that now we're reflecting more on our personal sort of reflections there. So as far as the paper goes, thank you, Amit, also for picking out a few. I was trying to avoid picking on any few in particular.
You bet my arm.
But as you can see, they're the ones that Amit pulled out were like ones that were so diverse in applications, right? So the clinical field is just one field, right? So there's contemplative education, right? So how is mindfulness entering into our schools? There's a big discussion about that. Like, what is the curriculum? Who's got the right curriculum, right? And are people even using the same curriculum when it's happening? And is it the same curriculum K through 12? Isn't there supposed to be some differences between how people develop, right? So there's just still a lot of questions, but a lot of things that picking on aspects of the science that weren't very, very good or were very pilot and preliminary. Or you can just say, look, what have we learned? Like you're saying, Ted, right? What have we learned? And I think that's a good place to start. And this whole discussion, what do we know? And then where do we go? And that's kind of what we've been saying, is that we're at that point of what do we know and where do we go?
Yeah, and that's where we'll hit that next. And that's something I really want to open up for this is, what are your thoughts about where we go? But I also want to give the opportunity, if there's anything that you want to share about what you commonly run into, that's this again.
About mindfulness?
About mindfulness, yeah.
I have two things that, truth is, I encounter them less frequently than I think I did in the past, which is interesting. I haven't actually thought about that before. One is about when people talk about mindfulness, sometimes they talk about all sorts of different things. Like a really good example is, what is a mindful organization? Mindful objects, mindful cultures. That's a challenge in the sense that I think about it in a narrower and maybe simpler way, just that we're talking about a form of attention and awareness to and of experience, and only that. And I think that there are consequences of that for people, for interactions, for families, for communities, for organizations. But our language can be limited in how we go about talking about, and I think it's really tough. Even when I try to reflect on it, I'm sort of stumped by how to go about describing the difficulty in talking about the various kinds of applications of mindfulness. And I think the second one I think it's a bit of a pet peeve is just this kind of extremely one-dimensional thinking or talk about mindfulness, that it's just present moment attention and awareness. It begins and ends there. That's what it is. And not as this deeper, more complex, dynamic process that sort of unfolds in consciousness from moment to moment. But I do have to say, I have heard, at least in my small circles, less and less of kind of talk about mindfulness in ways that rub me the wrong way.
Thank you, Amit. And it's interesting observation that is changing over time.
I think what came to mind for me when you asked this question was that, and as Dave has mentioned, I come from a clinical side, working with patients, and particularly from cognitive behavioral perspectives. There's a sense that what we do is manualized, what we offer are manualized interventions, which then also in terms of training means that if you've gone through several years of training, then part of your craft is that you can take these manuals and you can apply them. And so it's quite tempting for people then to think that mindfulness works in the same way. And so what you find within the field then are attempts to just take these practices and bring them in as problem solvers for something at some point. They might serve a certain function, and that's what you do, and that's where you stop. And they might actually do that in some sense, but it would be a shame to stop at that point. And of course, there are a lot of misunderstandings that can arise from that. So I remember just a very recent conversation with a PhD student who said, "Oh, I'm interested in mindfulness, and I tried this in a previous study. I had this meditation. I sent it to people, and I asked them to practice, and then I wanted to see what changed using some questionnaires and other tests and so forth. And disappointingly, people didn't practice that much. You just throw a practice at them and you hope for the best, and it might even make sense for them to practice, but there's so much more needed. And I think it's important not to be harsh about that, because it's driven by an interest in these things. So when mindfulness-based cognitive therapy developed, for example, there was a sense among the authors that this was mainly about attentional control in the beginning. And if you can achieve effects along those lines, that's actually an important start for our patients. But you don't want to stop there. And there's so much more for us to discover. And I think that's still important work.
Yeah, I think there's value in the idea of techniques. Yes, they're there. But if you stop with techniques, it's something you bring out of a toolkit and you use for whatever is happening to go on at that moment. And then you maybe put it away. And that's where you're really robbing yourself of the opportunity to have this as a different way of being, and how the impacts can be more than just that moment where you have some particular issue you want to try to solve or fix or work with, that there can be more. Thank you. And Dave, how about you?
How long is this? This might have to be a series. I think that you can hear it in the way we're describing even mindfulness, right? Like the whole just the idea of this. There's just one concept, which is naming an entire field after it. We're having such a hard time measuring it. That becomes one of the biggest problems I find in my work, is the problem with measuring mindfulness, right? Because, for example, you have this one study, and I hate to single it out, so sorry, Sarah Bowen, but Alan Marlatt did this great study on bringing mindfulness to college campuses, and they looked at binge drinking in this population, and they found that binge drinkers have higher levels of mindfulness than non-binge drinkers. And that's curious. So what does that mean? Does that say something about drinking alcohol and becoming more mindful? Or does it say something about, the difficulty or the ineffability of this concept, right, of mindfulness, this experience of mindfulness? And then then Paul Grossman actually took those scores and found that binge drinking students have higher levels of mindfulness than long-term meditators. So clearly, that's an issue that needs to be raised, and we need to think about what that means. And we don't have to say that it's bad science, right? It was a measure that was developed to capture of what paying attention in the present moment with non-judgmental curiosity looks like, right? So let's develop a measure for that and see if it works. It seems to be measuring something, whether it is mindfulness or not, is still, I think, up for debate. So those are the types of things, the nuances and the granularities of the science that I think you get in this kind of special issue. So that's what I've really enjoyed about putting together something of this magnitude, is that you're taking the commentary and the nuanced sort of that you don't see in the science, that you typically see in the reporting of the science, now in a special issue of opinions, because most of it is reflections on the science itself, not a direct reporting of the science necessarily. So some of the articles that were in there that certainly report on science for the first time, but a lot of it is just a reflection on the science and where it's going.
Yeah, the first two words of the title of this journal are current opinions in psychology. And that's an important aspect of that, not to lose sight of. So maybe our final topic that we can open up a little bit on with this, hearing the care that this is a field, and it's a field, and maybe in the same way that sports is. And there are lots of different games. There's clinical applications. There's maybe personal spiritual aspirations. There's neuroscience. There's a whole bunch of different things that are happening in that sports complex. Lots of different fields within it.
Yeah.
What are each of your thoughts about where we go? And again, this itself may be a current opinion that you have about what are some things you might like to see, or thoughts you have about what may happen that we perhaps don't like to see but should be aware of.
Well, I think that because there are so many different teams, games, and maybe even leagues going on here, I'll talk about a couple of them, because I think there are interesting things that are interesting developments that actually are probably are going to develop in parallel to one another, and are really in many ways independent of one another between these different domains. I can share a couple that are sort of in particularly of interest to me. One in particular, and it's also work that we've been doing in my group here, and then I think it dovetails nicely with what Dave was just talking about. And it's one of the few issues in the field that's relevant to all the players, which really is developing both conceptually coherent operational definitions of states of mindfulness, mindfulness as a process, mindfulness practices, and developing truly robust methods to study and measure them. And I don't know if it's going to happen, but I think one of the most important innovations that needs to happen is that the sophistication of the methodology that we use to either quantitatively or qualitatively or phenomenologically measure mindfulness needs to move in significant ways in order for many of these other areas, be it clinical applications or be it understanding cognitive or neural correlates or mechanisms. So much of this depends on the development and sophistication of mindfulness measurement. What else? Maybe you guys want to share a couple and then maybe come back around.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, we always talk about the methods, right? But and Thorsten also offered like this nice balance of like, okay, it's fair to say that a lot of the trials that have happened already have been stage 0 or really early pilot studies just to show efficacy, right, and feasibility. Yeah. And then we move into stage 1 and stage 2 trials, which are really about learning about, scaling it up, generalizability, and then mechanism and making sure that it's going to work. Right. So many of those have happened, but a lot of the trials that have happened have already been really rigorous. So there's a lot of evidence that's very strong. Yeah, I'm not sure. I just wanted to make sure that was clear when we say those things about the methods, right? So we can say that we can improve upon methods, but then we're also just starting to do these larger trials where we're starting to get the funding to do the larger trials, right? So to do those big trials takes a lot of money. You don't get those right away. They don't hand those to you without pilot data, right? So that's a lot of the data that you see out there is coming from that kind of early stage kind of research.
Right. And I think that's a very important aspect of this, David, is, and we mentioned this many times on the podcast, the listener who's familiar with this, is that, well, yes, it is an appropriate awareness that there are limited numbers in these various studies. And part of that is the limited funding for these studies. Yeah. You just described a very nice arc and we need some pilots to show, hey, there's something here. And now we can maybe get some of the funding to learn more about this and how it may be helpful to people in different ways.
or if you're philanthropic in nature and want to donate money for doing this research, we would gladly help.
We will help
as
spend
well.
your
No, but that is exactly right. And, to understand, when you look at the 18,000 studies that are out there, right, and that when Goyal et al. Shows only 47 have active controls. Well, what does that mean about the field? And so that doesn't necessarily mean that all the others were just crap. It just means that they come from an early stage of investigation. That's all. And so I think what we're doing is, like you're saying, we're learning, and we're going to continue learning what works and what doesn't work for people.
I completely agree. I think that's an important point, and this is why this exercise was so important, to have readable, short reviews of different domains that give you a sense of where are we with this. And as Dave has pointed out, there's a natural sequence to this. You don't start with a big effectiveness trial. That's simply not possible. But you start at points where you test acceptability, you test feasibility, and you take it from there. And so that takes a number of years. Yet when you look at, for example, applications in the field of depression, established therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, they've taken 5 decades to come to the point where MBCT has come to within just less than 20 years. So that development, for example, is one that actually gives a lot of reason for optimism, because it is quite healthy. It started with rigorous trials, which then were subjected to meta-analyses. The research has included at a later stage active controls and moved towards that. And we're now seeing an increased interest in understanding the mechanisms, having a very clear rationale of what it does and how it meets the needs of these patients, and seeing that it is helpful. We learn that yes, it is, but it is for a certain number of patients. And how do we understand better, and how do we move forward from that point in order to see what is it that needs to be done as our next step? And there are other problems as well. It is not just about understanding whether something is effective and how it works, but at the point where we realize that it is and it can be helpful, there's a huge demand out there, and we have to think about how do we actually bring it to people. That's one of the big challenges in the clinical field. So we have interventions which are helpful, but we don't reach people. And again, what you can read in the special issue is that the field is thinking about this. It's thinking about other formats to move this forward. And that, to me, all is very heartening, because it points towards a stepwise process where researchers are in dialogue, where this conversation is producing a cumulative endeavor towards improving our approaches and helping all of those who are in need of interventions.
Thank you, Thorsten. So, imposed on all of your time quite a lot today. I'm wondering if I might ask just one more thing of you, is perhaps just some final thoughts from each of you, broadly speaking, anything that you would like to share with the listeners. I'd like to start.
I could say something. We know today that there's probably about approximately 40 million, at least, Americans that meditate, right? And that number was like 13 million in 2012. Why are more people meditating? I think that's a valid question. Is it that they just believe in something just with blind faith? Maybe they're truly experiencing something that is shifting for them. What is it they're experiencing? Research, I think, wants to understand why people are using it, but also why it works. I don't think that for 2,700 years people have been doing these practices, that they would be still doing them if they didn't work, right? So we know that they work. The question is how they work and in what ways they work and what forms they work in contemporary settings, in secularized settings, in settings that are not monastic, right? So we're just learning all these new things, like you're saying, Ted. So I'm just going to throw that in there. I get very excited about this. So thank you for talking with us. That I much appreciate. And that's really all I can say. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for reading the special issue. It's an important time to reflect on, as John Kabat-Zinn would say, an inflection point for the species.
Thanks, David. And Amit, how about you? What are some final thoughts you might share with the listeners?
Well, I think one is that one of the hopes I have, I guess, is from this project is just the kind of remarkable reach and growth and really rapid dissemination and adoption of these kinds of practices, and really a whole host of contexts for a whole host of goals. And I think it's really cool. One of the hopes I have is that this community who's doing this science and disseminating these practices will also work to reach out and bring these practices, especially where they might be more therapeutic, to people on the periphery of our society that may not be as familiar, or may not have had sort of the privilege to come across MBSR groups and to really benefit from the kind of stress buffering, sometimes even transformative effects of these mindfulness and compassion practices. So that's one thing I'd sort of something that I think it's important. It's important for the field going forward. And the second thing I just want to say is that it's nice to be able to have this conversation for me. It's nice to just stop a bit and reflect on. I just feel like it was a real privilege, really, to work not only with Dave and Thorsten, which really was a privilege, but it was a real privilege that so many very talented folks from this field, a lot of them agreed to generously contribute to a project that in hindsight looks, sure, it's obvious, we totally needed it, this is great, but in foresight it was like, maybe, I don't know, another special issue, another...
Exactly.
And I learned so much from interactions with so many of these scholars and folks, and it was really quite fun, actually. It was really it was a really cool experience. So I'm really quite grateful.
It's a community, right? I mean, that's what I got out of it too. It's just to be able to have those conversations, right? You know, it was really impactful just for our own growth, right? It's intellectually, it's like to have a conversation with Jinpa. It's like, it doesn't happen every day, but it's nice to be able to make an excuse to make that happen and make that conversation happen.
Yeah.
Thorsten, how about for you? What are some final thoughts you might share with the listeners?
Yeah, very, very similar to what's been said. I think it's been a real privilege to be interacting with all of these authors, to be able to read, to learn from what they have to say. And I think I can get easily caught up in the science. I think that's important work. It needs to be done. There's something really important there. And so it's been nourishing to read that. It's been good to see that. But then also there's another component to it. And I was reminded when I read Saki Santorelli's papers, which look back at years and years of service for this community, of bringing mindfulness out there by one class after the other, by building this at an early point where, this wasn't inspired so much by an enthusiasm that was evident everywhere. And the way he described it, and the humble approach that he took to it, it's a reminder for me that it's important to always keep in mind the underlying values. Yeah.
Thank you, Thorsten. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good reminder.
Well, everyone who is listening to this will have some important links on the episode page for this episode. And I want to thank our guest today, Thorsten Barnhofer. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
David Vago. Dave, nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Ted.
And Amit Bernstein, thank you so much for being here as well.
Thanks, Tutu. It was fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.